So I'm going to be trying out a new format on these videos by using an introduction. And the reason I want to do that is because now that I do the voiceover, I try and put a lot of information during the build process of the videos. And sometimes it's a little hard to get all of it out there. So by kind of doing a broad overview of the project before I begin, I won't have to add that information in, and it will be a little bit easier on my end to get the dialogue out. So the project, I'm working on a couple things right now, but the next series I'm going to put up is this cabinet. And this is a cabinet that is going to go underneath of a kitchen island in a customer's house. So the dimensions of it was dictated by the space it's going to be going in, and it's on wheels. So the back two wheels will lock, and you'll be able to slide it in and out of the space. The design of the cabinet matches furniture that's already in the customer's home. So it's a very kind of simple shaker style cabinet with a little bit of molding detail, and it has inset drawers with the soft close bloom undermount slides. Now the top is going to get a piece of granite, so I probably will not get finished photos of this piece unless the customer sends them to me, but you'll be able to see what the cabinet looks like when it's done. And this is going to be painted, so it's almost ready for primer now, and it will be painted the color of the existing kitchen cabinets. So this might be a 2 or 3 part series. I haven't really started editing the footage yet, but that's usually what a project like this turns into 2 or 3 parts. So I'm going to try this format for now and see how it goes. Sometimes I just won't have time to fill an introduction, I think, because sometimes these projects, I'm ahead of them sometimes, and sometimes they're closer to real time, and it's a matter of sometimes they're finished and sent out to the customer that day, and I just won't have time to film. But this is going to be the next series. So to start this project, I'm making a plywood carcass which will hold the structure of the piece together as well as hold up the weight of the 3 drawers. So the internal structure is going to be made of 3/4 inch maple veneer ply. This is a higher end grade of plywood that's usually specifically made for making nicer cabinets. So I cut it down to rough size with a circular saw, and then cut it down to the size of the pieces I wanted on the table saw. And I marked out where all of my dados and rabbits are going to go, and the inside of this will be hiding some wheels, so the bottom shelf is going to be up fairly high compared to normal cabinetry. And then I'm going to be putting 3 little dado cuts and a rabbit cut on the top to hold the cross members, which are going to also be 3/4 inch plywood. So I found center and then used a scrap piece of plywood to make those marks. This is a really easy way to do it because plywood is not always the exact same dimension. So then I could go through and cut those top rabbits with my sacrificial fence in place. So I could just cut through about 3 or 4 inches and then lower onto the blade and cut the rest. I could move my fence and make the second cuts down. Once again, just going a little bit into the piece, then lowering it onto the plywood onto the blade and cutting those pieces. This is a very simple cut. It might look a little more dangerous than it really is. Then once again, for the middle cuts, I could do the exact same thing. And the nice thing about doing it this way is it ensures that both sides of my plywood, the measurements are exactly the same, cutting them this way on the table saw. So I could do both panels at once the same exact way. Then once that was done, I could go through and cut that bottom dado, and this one goes all the way through the piece because that will hold up the bottom shelf. And once again, I could do both of them with the exact same settings on the table saw. Once I had all my cuts, I can chisel out the excess. So I'm going to be cutting these strips in 3 inches, so I'm marking 3 inches, and then obviously because of the circular nature of the blade, it leaves an arc on the edge of that dado cut, so I could just go through with a chisel and trim out the excess. Now since this is 3/4 inch plywood, you could see my cuts went a little bit further past my 3-inch mark, but since it's 3/4 inch plywood, it's very rigid and structural as is, so it's okay if you go a little bit past your marks. And then I could go through and rip a bunch of 3-inch strips off of the same sheet of plywood, because these are going to be the cross members. And originally I put cross members in the back to hold up the drawer slides, but because this is such an odd shaped cabinet, I ended up going with smaller drawer slides. The longer ones wouldn't fit by like 3/4 of an inch. But I kept the ones in the back regardless, because it will help add to the rigidity of the piece. Once I had my 3-inch strips, then I could cut my bottom. And this is all being cut, accounting for the depth of the rabbet and the dados. And this essentially at the end of the day has to be 36 inches wide. There was no wiggle room in the clearances for this piece, so it was important to be able to measure the depths of those dados, which is about 3/8 of an inch. It's halfway through that 3/4 inch plywood. So then I could glue this all together. So I started by placing the bottom in place, and then I could attach all those middle supports, and then I could glue up the top, flip it over, and this actually worked a little bit better than I thought it was going to. Line everything up, hammer those into place, and then add the top pieces. Now what you didn't see me do in this video is I pre-drilled holes where the to go through the sides into all of the pieces and countersunk them, so that those were all ready to go. Because you won't see the sides of these plywood, I like to use screws to reinforce the joint, but more so that I don't have to use a bunch of clamps. I could put screws in the side and won't have to use clamps for this, which is nice because I don't have a ton of longer clamps. So once everything's in place, I could start adding screws through all of my sides, and it's really important to keep the two ends of this plywood, especially the front edge, which at this point can be either side because they're identical, flush with each other. If that plywood sticks out or undulates in any way, it will show up when you go to cover it. And then I could check for square and let that dry. So the outside of this piece is going to have decorative panels, and I'm making these exactly the same way I would doors. So I'm ripping down some poplar into 2-inch strips, and then I could start making my doors. So if this wasn't such a heavy piece, you could probably get away with just making some panels, but because this was going to be holding so much weight and have a granite countertop, that's why I have the inner plywood frame. It was really important. So these outside pieces are purely decorative. They're not really structural at all. So I decided to have the rails be the full length of these doors. Usually it's the stiles, but I wanted the joint up top to not have any interruptions in it. So I went through and cut all of my rails that I needed, because those wouldn't be cut down in the end. And I could have set up a stop for this, but I just measured and cut all of them. So I have all of my rails. Then the interior panel of this is going to be 1/4 inch plywood, so I have my 1/4 inch dado stack in my table saw blade, and then I could run all of my pieces through. I rough cut my stiles as well. The reason I like to run these pieces through in smaller bits versus one long piece, which you can do, is because this poplar from Lowe's is a nice grade of lumber. It makes life really easy not having to joint and plane it, but it's not perfect. So in the smaller pieces, your groove in the center turns out more true when it's not one long piece. Then I could go through and cut the tongue that's going to go on these, and this is a test piece as well. And once I get a nice tight fit, I know the measurements in my table saw, and my blade is perfect. You can see everything's flush, and that inner groove is the exact same depth, so the panel can fit inside of it. So once I have that, I can measure for my stiles, which is going to be the height I need minus the thickness of the rails. So you can see the easiest way to do it is to just put it on there and line it up with the tongue. Once you have that mark, I could cut all six. I think there was almost 9 of these, because the middle panel has seven of them. And I could cut these all at once because they're going to give me my height, which the total height couldn't go higher than 29.5. Once that was done, since I already had this narrowed in, I could go through and cut all of my tongues. And there's a center piece to this that goes on the back, which I put a groove on both sides. The nice thing about this project was since I used 1/4-inch plywood instead of the 3/32, I could get away with having the dado stack cut that groove. Otherwise you have to use your 1/8 inch blade and make 2 passes on the saw. The 1/4-inch plywood is a little more expensive, but it does save some time. I could dry fit the pieces together, make sure that they all fit and are all square, and then go from there. So you can see this is the one with the center that has the 2 grooves on the side. Just adds a little bit more of a decorative element. There's that panel. It's also going to be sturdier with that added support. So once all of these were dry fitted together, I can measure my inside measurement and add an inch because my groove is a 1/2 inch on either side, so you have to add an inch to the panel. And I could take some liberties when I know something's going to be painted because you won't see pencil marks on it. So just write those measurements right on the frames and then rough cut this 1/4-inch plywood. This is also a birch veneer ply. Could rough cut it with my circular saw and then cut it down to size on the table saw. And then, like I said, I had those measurements and I could rough cut it down to size. And then also, like I said, since this is 1/4-inch ply, it fits in that 1/4-inch dado groove quite nicely. It makes a little bit of a stronger panel. So then I could dry fit all of my pieces together. I like to do this before I glue them up, even though I very rarely have any mistakes or undulations in the dry fit, just because now what I could do is pop off the 2 ends, add glue very easily, and pop them back on. So this is one of the side panels, and everything fits nicely. Roughly check for square, but I really don't worry about square until they're glued up. Make sure everything fits nicely. And then I also dry fitted that middle panel. It's the exact same thing. Putting this one together, I marked center, so that center partition, these 2 panels are the exact same size. Could slide them right into place and add the top, and then these are all ready for glue up. So then you could see here I'm only adding glue to the tongues of these pieces. You don't want to get glue on your plywood because it's hard to tell, but there's still a little gap around the perimeter of the plywood and the poplar, and that is for expansion and contraction. If you glue the plywood and it can't freely move into place, your door could actually crack. So like I said, I could just easily pop off my 2 rails, add the glue, pop them back on, make sure everything is flush, and then check for square. These usually square up very nicely. Sometimes you just have to shift them a little bit if they're off square, and then I go through and put a brad on either side just to hold them in place. Whenever I flip it, I always recheck for square because, believe it or not, sometimes just flipping the panel can throw it off even a fraction of an inch. Put some brads in that side, and then they're ready to go. And this is where this video is going to end, with those panels ready to be attached to the plywood carcass.